Have you ever wondered who watches over you on your journeys? In the rich tradition of the Catholic Church, there exists a saint whose story has inspired millions of the faithful throughout the centuries, Saint Christopher. Known as the patron saint of travelers, drivers, and pilgrims, this giant of faith carried on his shoulders not only countless travelers needing to cross a dangerous river, but also, according to tradition, the infant Jesus himself. His name, Christopher, literally means Christ-bearer in Greek, a perfect description of his life and legacy. Today, we'll explore the life, martyrdom, and devotion to this great saint, discovering how his example can illuminate our own path of faith in the contemporary world. Chapter 1. The origins of Saint Christopher. Under the scorching sun of a small village in the ancient world, a child was born who would shake the very earth beneath his feet. This was the 3rd century AD, a time of persecution and martyrdom, when the Roman Empire still resisted the advance of the cross. The newborn was given the name reprobate, an ominous appellation that seemed to seal a fate of darkness. No one could imagine that this infant, who cried with unearthly force, would centuries later be known as the bearer of Christ. The village mothers watched in amazement as this child grew at an unusual rate. At 5, he towered over many adults. At 10, he could lift rocks that 3 men together could barely move. His father, a rugged caravan merchant, saw in this prodigious strength a gift from the pagan gods and spared no sacrifices in thanking them. "My son will be the most feared warrior of the East," he proclaimed proudly, as he poured wine for his guests. Reprobate, seated in a corner due to his size, listened to these words with a mixture of pride and unease in his young heart. A question stirred that would accompany him for years. For what purpose has this strength been given to me? The transition from childhood to youth only accentuated his extraordinary physique. At 18, Reprobate stood like a giant among men. His head brushed the door lintels, his hands could bend swords like reeds, and his deep voice resonated like thunder in the mountains. Merchants visiting the village looked at him with a mixture of fear and fascination, offering his father riches to employ him as a guardian for their caravans. However, young Reprobate rejected these offers, for within him grew an ambition greater than that of a mere guardian. "If I am to serve," he pondered while gazing at the night stars, "it will be only the most powerful." This unease crystallized into a decision that would change the course of his existence. One night, after a heated argument with his father, who insisted he accept the lucrative offer of an Antioch merchant, Reprobate gathered his meager belongings. "Father," he said with determination as the old man watched him incredulously, "I have decided to set out in search of the most powerful king in the world. To him alone will I offer my services." His mother's pleas, his father's threats, and the tears of his younger siblings could not dissuade him. At dawn, as the first rays of sun gilded the surrounding hills, the imposing figure of Reprobate was already moving away along the dusty road eastward, following the trade routes that led to the great cities where, according to travelers' tales, the most powerful monarchs of the known world resided. His pilgrimage took him through scorching deserts and snow-capped mountains, bustling cities and wretched villages. Finally, after months of travel, he arrived at the court of a king whose reputation for power had transcended borders. The monarch, impressed by the stranger's stature and strength, immediately welcomed him into his personal guard. "You have found what you sought," the sovereign told him, handing him a golden breastplate that reflected the light of the torches. "For there is no more powerful king on earth than I." Reprobate smiled with satisfaction, believing he had achieved his goal. For months he faithfully served that king, distinguishing himself in battles and tournaments, earning the respect of soldiers and nobles alike. However, fate had a lesson in store for him about true power. One night, during a banquet, a minstrel mentioned the devil in one of his ballads. To reprobate's surprise, the king hastily made the sign of the cross, visibly paling. Intrigued, the giant waited for the feast to end before approaching his lord. "Your Majesty," he asked respectfully but firmly, "why do you make the sign of the cross upon hearing the name of the devil? Do you fear him?" The sovereign, troubled by the direct question, lowered his gaze and confessed, "Yes, I fear the devil, for his power is greater than mine. He can tempt me, cause me to fall into sin, and drag my soul to eternal damnation." That answer was like a thunderbolt that shattered reprobate's certainties. If his king feared the devil, then he was not the most powerful. Disappointed but resolute, the giant stripped off his armor and laid it at the foot of the throne. "I have served you believing you were the most powerful lord," he declared in a firm voice. "But now I know there is another stronger than you. I shall go in search of him." And so, without waiting for a reply, he left the palace, leaving behind riches and honors to continue his quest for true power. Chapter 2. The Giant Who Crossed the River. The search for the devil led reprobate down dark and dangerous paths. Following rumors and tales from fearful travelers, the giant ventured into a wooded region where, it was said, a band of outlaws resided, led by a man who proclaimed himself a servant of the Lord of Darkness. The forest seemed to whisper secrets as reprobate advanced among centuries-old trees whose crowns hid the sunlight. The sounds of nature fell silent at his passing, as if the creatures of the woods sensed the presence of something extraordinary. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, reprobate was surprised by the sudden attack of several men who emerged from the bushes with savage cries. Despite their number, they posed no threat to the giant's immense strength, who effortlessly disarmed 3 of them and seized the apparent leader by the neck. "Wait!" the bandit exclaimed, struggling to breathe. "I've been watching you. I've never seen anyone so strong. Join us, and together we will serve the true Lord of Power, the devil." The reprobate loosened his grip and looked with interest at the man with sunken eyes and tangled beard. "Do you serve the devil?" he asked, recalling the fearful words of his former king. "Of course," the bandit replied with a crooked smile. "He is the one who protects us and grants us success in our endeavors. There is no greater power than his." Those words resonated in the restless heart of the reprobate, who decided to join the band with the hope of finally encountering this most powerful being. For weeks, the giant of faith participated in the raids on caravans and lone travelers. His presence alone was enough to make the victims surrender their belongings without resistance, which greatly pleased the bandit leader. However, the reprobate began to notice something strange. Every time the band approached a crossroads where a wooden cross stood, the leader would divert the route, avoiding passing near the Christian symbol. It happened one afternoon when, pursued by soldiers after a particularly lucrative raid, the safest escape route passed right next to one of those crosses. The leader, pale and sweating, preferred to risk a more dangerous route. When they finally managed to evade their pursuers and set up camp in a forest clearing, the reprobate confronted the bandit. "Why do you fear that symbol? If you serve the most powerful being, what can a simple wooden cross do to you?" The leader, visibly uncomfortable, took a long swig of wine before answering. "It is the symbol of the crucified Christ. The devil himself trembles before it and dares not approach that cursed wood." That confession was like a flash of clarity in the reprobate's mind. If the devil feared Christ, then Christ must be more powerful. His search had taken a surprising new turn. That same night, while his companions slept exhausted after celebrating their spoils, the reprobate silently abandoned the camp. He was no longer interested in serving the devil. Now his heart yearned to find this Christ whom even the Prince of Darkness feared. But where to look? How to find someone who had died crucified? With these questions burning in his mind, the giant wandered for days along unknown paths, until finally hunger and fatigue forced him to stop by a stream to quench his thirst. As he drank the fresh water, he heard the sound of a bell in the distance. Following that crystalline sound, the reprobate arrived at a small hermitage built on a hillside. There, an old man with a white beard and serene eyes came to meet him, showing no fear of his imposing figure. "I was expecting you," the hermit said simply. Confused, the reprobate asked, "How could you be expecting me if I didn't even know I was coming here?" The old man smiled gently. "The Lord revealed to me that a sincere seeker would arrive at my door today. Come in, my son, and let us share bread while you tell me what brings you to these parts." By the warmth of a modest fire, the reprobate recounted his story to the hermit, his birth in a remote village in the ancient world, his extraordinary strength, his desire to serve the most powerful, his disappointment with the fearful ruler, his brief association with the bandits, and finally, his discovery that someone more powerful than the devil existed, the crucified Christ. "Now I want to find him and serve him," the giant concluded sincerely. "Can you teach me how to do that?" The hermit looked at the reprobate for a long time, as if measuring the authenticity of his words. Then, taking a small crucifix that hung around his neck, he replied, "Christ is not far from you. He said, 'Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them.' If you want to serve him, you must begin by knowing him. Stay with me, and I will teach you his ways." Thus began the reprobate's catechumenate, a period of instruction in the truths of the Christian faith. The giant listened attentively to the hermit's teachings on the scriptures, the life of Christ, the sacraments, and Christian virtues. However, when the old man spoke about fasting and continuous prayer as means of drawing closer to God, the reprobate felt discouraged. "Father," he confessed humbly, "I have never been a man of many words, and my body requires abundant food to maintain my strength. I fear I may not be able to serve Christ in that way." The hermit, far from rebuking him, reflected in silence as he gazed at the fire. Finally, as if inspired by an inner light, he rose and led the reprobate to the entrance of the hermitage, from where a large river snaked through the valley could be seen. Chapter 3. The Encounter with the Christ Child. The storm lashed the valley with unrestrained fury, as if the forces of nature had decided to unleash all their wrath on that region. Inside his humble hut, the reprobate had retired to rest after a particularly exhausting day. Tiredness weighed heavily on his eyelids as he listened to the wind howling through the trees and the rain violently beating against the roof of his shelter. No one would dare travel on a night like this, he thought, as he settled into his simple straw bed. Sleep was beginning to envelop him when suddenly something extraordinary happened. A voice, clear as crystal, pierced the roar of the storm. "Reprobate! Reprobate! Come and help me cross the river." The giant sat up startled. Had it been his imagination? He strained his ears, but all he could hear was the roar of the rain and the wind. When he was about to lie down again, the voice was heard again. "Reprobate, please, I need your help." This time, there was no doubt someone was calling him from the other side. With a sigh of resignation, the giant rose from his bed. His duty was to help travelers, regardless of the time or conditions. He took his staff, lit a torch, protecting it as best he could with a piece of leather, and went out to face the tempest. The wind almost knocked him down as soon as he stepped outside the hut. The rain, driven horizontally by the gusts, struck his face like tiny needles. Raising the torch, which struggled to stay lit, he scanned the opposite bank. What he saw left him dumbfounded. There, perfectly visible despite the darkness and the curtain of water, was a small child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the reprobate. "Who would leave a child alone on a night like this?" Without wasting any more time, the giant plunged into the raging river, which roared with an intensity never seen before. The current, strengthened by the torrential rain, pulled at his legs with unusual violence. With each step, the reprobate had to thrust his staff into the riverbed to avoid being swept away. The water, normally at his knees, now reached almost to his waist. When he finally reached the opposite bank, he was even more astonished by what he saw. The child remained completely dry, as if an invisible bubble shielded him from the storm. His clothes, simple yet immaculately white, contrasted sharply with the dark night. But most striking were his eyes, deep, serene, a color impossible to define, that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the universe. "Where are your parents, little one?" Reprobate asked, leaning down to be heard over the roar of the storm. The child smiled with a sweetness that seemed to illuminate the night. "I came alone," he replied in a voice that, though childish, possessed a strangely mature quality. "I need to cross the river, and I've been told you help travelers." Something in that gaze, in that voice, sent a shiver down Reprobate's spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the night's chill. Gently, despite his enormous hands, calloused by years of labor, the giant lifted the child and placed him on his shoulders. "Hold on tight," he warned as he prepared to face the current again. The first step back was surprisingly easy, as if the child weighed nothing at all. This will be a quick trip, Reprobate thought, relieved. However, when he reached the center of the river where the current was strongest, something extraordinary began to happen. With each new step, the weight on his shoulders inexplicably increased. What had begun as a light burden progressively transformed into a colossal weight, as if he were carrying an entire mountain. "What's happening?" Reprobate wondered, bewildered. His muscles, accustomed to carrying people and goods without apparent effort, now trembled under superhuman pressure. "Child," he managed to articulate between gasps, "what are you carrying? It's like I'm carrying the entire world on my shoulders." The river waters also seemed to respond to this strange anomaly, suddenly rising to reach his chest, threatening to submerge him completely. The current became more violent, as if some supernatural force wanted to prevent them from completing the crossing. Reprobate, who had never known the limits of his strength, felt the taste of fear in his mouth for the first time. With each step, the weight increased, bending his back, sinking his feet into the muddy riverbed. The torch, finally overcome by the rain, went out, leaving them in utter darkness. At that critical moment, when his legs threatened to give way and the current seemed about to drag him under, Reprobate experienced a strange, inner calm, an inexplicable certainty that despite the danger, he must continue. Gathering his last strength, he plunged his staff into the riverbed and clung to it as if it were his last hope. "Lord of heaven," he murmured, instinctively addressing the God he was only beginning to know, "give me strength to carry this child to the shore." In answer to his prayer, he felt a small, warm hand rest on his head. And then, the extraordinary happened. A soft yet penetrating light began to emanate from the child on his shoulders, illuminating the turbulent waters around them. Despite the storm that continued to roar, Reprobate could clearly see the path to the shore. With renewed vigor, driven by a force that seemed to come from beyond himself, the giant continued to advance, step by step. The weight was still almost unbearable, but now there was something more, an indescribable feeling of participating in something transcendental, something beyond his comprehension. When his feet finally touched the firm ground of the bank, Reprobate fell to his knees, exhausted. With trembling hands, he helped the child down from his shoulders and placed him in front of him. "Child," he said between ragged breaths, "you have put me in great danger. I have never carried such a heavy burden. Who are you? Who weighs more than any man, more than any load I have ever carried in my life?" The answer he received would forever change the course of his existence. The child looked at him with eyes that now shone with a supernatural light. The storm around them seemed to subside, as if nature itself held its breath before what was about to be revealed. "Do not be amazed, Reprobate," the child said in a voice that no longer sounded childish, but resonated with the authority of the ages. "You have not only carried the weight of the world on your shoulders, but Him who created the world. I am Christ, your King, whom you serve by helping travelers." Those words fell upon reprobate like a thunderbolt, illuminating the darkness of his soul. Everything fit together. His search for the most powerful being, the devil's fear of the cross, the hermit's teachings. Everything had led him to this moment, to this encounter with the king. He had been seeking his whole life. A mixture of reverent awe and indescribable joy flooded his heart as he contemplated the child who now shone with a glory that was not of this world. "My Lord and my God," reprobate murmured, bowing his head until his forehead touched the ground in a gesture of spontaneous adoration. The child smiled and extended his hand to touch the giant's head. "You have been faithful in little things, reprobate," he said with infinite tenderness. "I will entrust you with much more. As a sign that I am who I say I am, plant your staff in the ground next to your hut. By sunrise, you will see it blossoming and laden with fruit, just as your life will now blossom in faith." Before reprobate could respond, a blinding light enveloped the child, forcing the giant to cover his eyes with his hand. When the light dissipated and he could look again, the child had vanished. Only his words remained echoing in his heart, and an absolute certainty that would never leave him. He had carried Christ on his shoulders. He had held the Creator of the universe. He had been an instrument of divine love. Trembling, not from exertion but from emotion, reprobate got up and returned to his hut. Before entering, remembering the child's words, he planted his staff in the damp earth beside the entrance. Then, overcome by physical exhaustion and spiritual commotion, he fell into a deep sleep filled with heavenly visions. With the first light of dawn, reprobate awoke with a start. Had it all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? He rushed out of his hut, and what he saw dispelled all doubt. Where he had planted his staff, a date palm now stood, lush and laden with sweet fruit, even though it was not the right season or climate for such a tree. The miracle confirmed the reality of his nighttime encounter and sealed his definitive conversion. Falling to his knees before the miraculous tree, reprobate, soon to be known as Christopher, the Christ-bearer, let tears of gratitude and awe stream down his weathered face. His search was over. He had found the most powerful king, not in a palace, not in the darkness of demonic forces, but in the person of a child who had asked for his help in the midst of the storm. Chapter 4. Conversion and Baptism. Deeply moved by his encounter with the Christ child, Christopher sought instruction in the Christian faith. His heart, once focused on the pursuit of earthly power, now burned with the desire to learn more about the one he had carried on his shoulders. Guided by divine providence, he found a priest who, amazed by the giant's account and recognizing God's work in his life, agreed to prepare him for holy baptism. During this time of catechesis, Christopher learned the fundamental truths of the Catholic faith, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, the incarnation of the Word, the redemption wrought by Christ on the cross, and the constant presence of the Holy Spirit in the Church. Each new teaching illuminated his mind and strengthened his resolve to dedicate his life completely to the service of the true King. The day of his baptism was a celebration of profound spiritual significance. Clad in the white robe of a newly initiated Christian, Christopher descended into the baptismal waters, symbolizing his death to the old self, emerging. He was reborn as a new creature in Christ. He who had been known as reprobate, the condemned, now officially received the name Christopher, the Christ-bearer, sealing the transformation that had begun by the river. After his baptism, Christopher received the Holy Eucharist for the first time, experiencing a mystical union with the one he had physically carried on his shoulders. This sacramental encounter further strengthened his determination to carry Christ not only in his name, but in every aspect of his life, and to everyone he encountered on his path. Christopher's conversion did not go unnoticed. Many of the travelers he continued to help cross the river were impressed not only by his physical strength, but by the inner transformation that radiated from him. The giant used these encounters to share his testimony and speak of the love of Christ. Thus, without abandoning his original service, he began an apostolate that would lead many souls to faith, fulfilling literally and spiritually his new name, Christopher, bearer of Christ. Chapter 5. The Apostolate of Saint Christopher. Strengthened by the sacraments and burning with apostolic zeal, Christopher soon felt the call to expand his ministry beyond the river. While he continued to help travelers cross the dangerous waters, he now also dedicated himself to preaching the gospel with fervor and conviction. His testimony was particularly powerful. He, who had sought to serve the mightiest, had found the King of Kings in the figure of a helpless child. In his sermons, Christopher used his own story as a living metaphor for the spiritual journey. He explained how every person carries a burden in life, but when that burden is Christ himself, although it may seem heavy, it is actually he who sustains us. With simple yet profound words, he adapted the gospel message to make it understandable to people of all social classes and educational levels. The region where Christopher developed his apostolate was steeped in idolatry and pagan superstitions. With courage and determination, the saint confronted these practices, destroying idols and demonstrating the emptiness of false gods. According to some traditions, in the city of Samos, in Lycia, present-day Turkey, Christopher planted his staff, the one that had miraculously blossomed, in the middle of the pagan temple, causing the idols to collapse, thus manifesting the supreme power of Christ. Christopher's apostolate was not limited to preaching. With the same generosity with which he had helped travelers cross the river, he now cared for the sick, consoled the afflicted, and shared his meager possessions with the needy. His extraordinary stature and strength, once used on the battlefield, now served to protect the weak and build places of worship to the true God. The fame of his works and preaching spread rapidly, attracting multitudes who wanted to hear the converted giant. It is estimated that through his testimony and example, thousands of people abandoned paganism and embraced the Christian faith. This evangelizing success, however, would soon attract the hostile attention of the Roman authorities, who saw in the growing Christian community a threat to the established order and imperial worship. Chapter 6. The Martyrdom of the Saint. During the reign of Emperor Decius, one of the harshest periods of persecution against Christians, the fame of Christopher reached the ears of the governor of Lycia, named Dagno according to some traditions. Furious at the mass conversions the giant was promoting, Dagno sent 200 soldiers with the mission of arresting him and bringing him before his presence. The soldiers, impressed by Christopher's stature and noble bearing, hesitated to carry out their mission. Far from taking advantage of this to escape, the saint invited them to rest and share his food. During the meal, he spoke of Christ with such conviction that many of them, touched by divine grace, converted on the spot. Finally, Christopher voluntarily presented himself before Dagno, accompanied by the soldiers, some of whom were already determined to share his fate. Seeing him enter the palace, the governor was overcome with fear, even falling from his throne. Once recovered, he tried to persuade Christopher to renounce his faith and offer sacrifices to the Roman gods. He promised him riches, honors, and even the hand of beautiful women. Christopher firmly rejected all these temptations, declaring that his only treasure was Christ and that no material good could compare to eternal glory. Enraged by this resistance, Dagno ordered that Christopher be subjected to cruel tortures. First, he was flogged with iron rods and then placed on a red-hot iron bench. However, miraculously, the bench melted like wax, leaving the saint unharmed. Then Dagno ordered that arrows be shot at him, but they remained suspended in the air without touching him, until one of them changed direction and blinded the governor. Christopher, moved by Christian compassion, told Dagno that his blood, mixed with earth and applied to his eyes, would restore his sight. The governor, desperate, followed the advice, and his sight was restored. This miracle, according to some accounts, led to Dagno's conversion. However, other versions tell a different story. Hardened in his wickedness, he ultimately ordered the saint's beheading. On July 25th, likely in the year 251 AD, Christopher gave up his soul to God, achieving the crown of martyrdom. Before his death, he prayed for all who would invoke his protection, especially travelers and those facing sudden death. This final prayer would become the foundation of the special devotion that the faithful would profess to Saint Christopher throughout the centuries. Chapter 7. Veneration through the ages. From the earliest times after his martyrdom, devotion to Saint Christopher spread rapidly throughout Christendom. The faithful, impressed by his story of conversion, service, and martyrdom, began to invoke him as their protector on journeys. As early as the 4th century, churches dedicated to his memory existed in Chalcedon, Constantinople, and other important cities of the Eastern Roman Empire. During the Middle Ages, the veneration of St. Christopher reached its peak. It was firmly believed that contemplating an image of the saint protected against sudden death that day. For this reason, huge paintings or statues of Saint Christopher were placed in visible locations within churches, especially near the entrances, so the faithful could see them as they entered or left the temple. Some of these representations, like the one in the Toledo Cathedral in Spain or the Church of Saint Christopher in Ravenna, Italy, are true masterpieces of medieval art. The Crusades significantly contributed to the spread of the veneration of Saint Christopher. The Crusader knights, facing the dangers of long journeys and battles in distant lands, found in him a powerful intercessor. Many carried medals or small statues of the saint as protective talismans. Upon their return to Europe, these warriors built chapels and hermitages dedicated to Saint Christopher as a thank you for his protection. In the 13th century, the famous Golden Legend by Jacobus de Voragine further popularized the story of Saint Christopher. This compilation of saints' lives, widely read and translated into numerous vernacular languages, presented a vivid narrative of the giant who carried Christ on his shoulders, capturing the imagination of generations of the faithful. Despite the revision of the liturgical calendar after the Second Vatican Council, which reduced the solemnity of his feast day due to a scarcity of verifiable historical data, popular devotion to St. Christopher has remained vibrant. In many communities, especially in Latin America and Southern Europe, the feast day of July 25th continues to be celebrated with processions, the blessing of vehicles, and other expressions of popular faith, keeping the memory of the saint who carried Christ alive in the hearts of the faithful. Chapter 8. Saint Christopher as patron saint of travelers. The designation of Saint Christopher as the patron saint of travelers is rooted in the very core of his story. That giant who dedicated part of his life to helping pilgrims cross a dangerous river. This act of service, which foreshadowed his later encounter with the Christ child, established a natural connection between the saint and all those who undertake a journey. With the advent of modern means of transportation, Saint Christopher's patronage naturally extended to drivers, pilots, sailors, and all professionals related to transportation. In many Catholic countries, it is common to find medals or small statues of Saint Christopher in vehicles, as a visible sign of the protection expected from the saint during travel. The Catholic Church has recognized and fostered this devotion through specific blessings. The Roman ritual includes a special blessing for vehicles on the feast day of Saint Christopher, a ceremony that gathers numerous faithful in parishes around the world. During these celebrations, priests sprinkle holy water on cars, motorcycles, and other means of transportation, invoking the saint's intercession so that their occupants travel safely beyond the physical aspect of the journey. Saint Christopher has also become the patron saint of the spiritual journey that represents the Christian life. Just as the saint carried Christ on his shoulders, every baptized person is called to carry Christ in their heart and manifest it in their actions. This spiritual dimension of Saint Christopher's patronage is reflected in homilies and reflections that invite the faithful to be authentic Christophoros, bearers of Christ, in the contemporary world. In various parts of the world, there are sanctuaries dedicated to Saint Christopher that have become pilgrimage destinations. These sacred places, often located on mountain passes or alongside important routes, offer travelers a space to entrust their journeys to the saint's protection. One of the most famous is the Sanctuary of Saint Christopher in Avila, Spain, where thousands of drivers go annually to receive a blessing for their vehicles. Chapter 9. Miracles attributed to his intercession. Throughout the centuries, countless faithful have attributed favors and miracles to the intercession of Saint Christopher. These testimonies, passed down from generation to generation, have contributed to strengthening and expanding devotion to the patron saint of travelers. Although many of these accounts belong to the realm of popular piety and have not been subjected to canonical verification processes, they reflect the sincere faith of those who have experienced the saint's protection in moments of danger. One of the most frequently reported miracles is related to accidents inexplicably avoided. There are countless testimonies of drivers who, facing imminent danger, have invoked Saint Christopher and have managed to escape unharmed from circumstances that, in all probability, should have been fatal. Many of these devotees keep the remains of their destroyed vehicles as ex-votos, along with images of the saint that remained intact despite the impact. In the Italian city of Bari, the memory of a miracle that occurred during a terrible epidemic in the 17th century is preserved. According to tradition, the city's inhabitants, desperate in the face of the disease's advance, organized a procession with the image of Saint Christopher. The next day, the epidemic inexplicably began to subside. In gratitude, a chapel dedicated to the saint was built, which is still visited today by pilgrims seeking his protection against sudden illnesses. During World War II, numerous Catholic soldiers carried medals of Saint Christopher. Documented cases exist of military personnel attributing their survival in extreme situations to Saint Christopher's intercession. One particularly striking example involves a US pilot whose plane was hit by enemy fire over the Pacific. Despite catastrophic damage, he managed to keep the aircraft airborne long enough to reach Allied territory. The pilot always maintained he clearly saw the figure of Saint Christopher guiding his plane during those critical minutes. In Latin America, especially in mountainous regions with treacherous roads, numerous impromptu shrines dedicated to Saint Christopher are found at spots where drivers survived horrific accidents. These small monuments, adorned with flowers and votive offerings, serve as visible testaments to the gratitude of those who believe they received the saint's protection, and as a reminder to other travelers that they are not alone on their journey. Chapter 10. Iconography and representation in sacred art. The figure of Saint Christopher has inspired countless artists throughout the history of Christian art, resulting in a rich and distinctive iconography that makes him easily identifiable. The most characteristic representation shows him as a man of gigantic stature, wading through a turbulent river while carrying the Christ child on his shoulders. The child often holds an orb in his hand, a symbol of his universal sovereignty. In early Byzantine representations, Saint Christopher sometimes appeared with the head of a dog or wolf, cynocephalus. Following a literal interpretation of his original name, reprobate, meaning rejected or condemned. This curious iconography, primarily found in ancient Orthodox icons, also stemmed from the medieval belief that he came from a tribe of half-human, half-canine beings from distant lands. However, this representation was abandoned in Western art in favor of the more human image of the giant carrying Christ. During the Middle Ages, as mentioned earlier, enormous frescoes of St. Christopher adorned the entrances of many churches. These monumental images, some over 30 feet tall, allowed the faithful to comply with the belief that seeing an image of the saint protected against sudden death that day. Notable examples of these colossal representations are preserved in the Toledo Cathedral in Spain, at the Church of St. Christopher Lestaux in London, and in numerous temples along the Camino de Santiago. The Renaissance brought greater naturalism and realism to the saint's depiction. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch, Dürer, and Titian created images of St. Christopher that, while retaining the essential elements of his iconography, the giant, the river, the child, incorporate realistic details and elaborate landscape backgrounds. Particularly noteworthy is Titian's St. Christopher, 1523, where the saint appears as a powerful old man with an expression of awe at feeling the divine weight on his shoulders. In Baroque art, the figure of St. Christopher becomes more dynamic, showing him in full exertion as he crosses the turbulent waters. The garments become more elaborate and theatrical, and the Christ child is often depicted radiating light as a manifestation of his divinity. The Spanish painter José de Ribera created several striking versions of the saint, characterized by an intense chiaroscuro that underscores the drama of the moment. Contemporary iconography of St. Christopher has maintained traditional elements, adapting them to new artistic styles. A modern innovation is the inclusion of automobiles or other means of transportation in the saint's representations, emphasizing his patronage over travelers in the age of mechanized mobility. These new interpretations, while updated in their context, preserve the essence of the message. St. Christopher is the one who helps us carry Christ on our journey through life. Chapter 11. Lessons for our daily lives. St. Christopher's life, beyond the legendary elements that may enrich it, contains profound lessons that can illuminate our daily existence as 21st century Christians. His spiritual journey offers valuable teachings that we can apply to our lives. Regardless of our vocation or particular circumstances, the first great lesson St. Christopher gives us is the importance of a sincere search. As a reprobate, he dedicated a large part of his life to seeking the most powerful Lord to serve. This restlessness, this yearning to find something greater than himself, reflects the fundamental restlessness of the human heart which, as St. Augustine expressed, is restless until it rests in Thee, O Lord. In our contemporary world, characterized by relativism and superficiality, the figure of St. Christopher reminds us of the importance of seeking truth with sincerity and perseverance. The second teaching relates to the discovery of one's personal vocation. When the hermit suggested to Christopher that he use his physical strength to help travelers cross the river, he was showing him how to put his natural gifts at the service of others and of God. Each of us has received specific talents that, far from being a cause for personal vanity, are meant to serve our brothers and sisters. Holiness does not consist in doing extraordinary things, but in doing ordinary things extraordinarily well, putting our particular abilities at the service of the common good. Christopher's encounter with the Christ child teaches us that Christ often presents himself in our lives in unexpected ways, often through the smallest and most vulnerable. What you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did for me, Jesus said. This identification of Christ with the needy constitutes an urgent call to recognize the face of the Lord in every person we meet on our path, especially in the most helpless and marginalized members of our society. St. Christopher's conversion illustrates that it is never too late to change course. From pagan warrior to bearer of Christ, his life underwent a radical transformation that demonstrates the transformative power of divine grace. In our own lives, regardless of our past or the mistakes we have made, there is always the possibility of a new beginning, of a fundamental reorientation toward good and truth. The Saints' apostolate reminds us of our responsibility as the baptized to be evangelizers in our daily environments. Not all of us are called to preach in the town squares as Christopher did, but we all can and should bear witness to our faith through our words and, above all, through our example. In a world thirsty for authenticity, our consistent witness might be the most effective way to bring Christ to those around us. Ultimately, St. Christopher's martyrdom speaks to unwavering faith, to fidelity to the very end, in a society that prizes comfort and shuns sacrifice. The martyr's witness reminds us that there are values worth giving our lives for. While we may not face bloody persecution, every day presents us with small opportunities for daily martyrdom. Faithfulness to the truth when it would be easier to remain silent. Firmness in our principles when social pressure pushes us in the opposite direction. Perseverance in doing good when exhaustion tempts us to give up. Thus, the figure of St. Christopher, far from being merely a character from the past or a protective amulet for travelers, stands as an inspiring model for all Christians who, amidst the turbulence of contemporary life, seek to cross the river of existence carrying Christ not only in name, but in heart and in deeds. Chapter 12. A prayer to Saint Christopher Glorious. Saint Christopher, whose name means bearer of Christ, you who humbly and strongly carried on your shoulders not only countless travelers, but the Christ child himself, Lord of the universe, hear our prayer. You, who were blessed with extraordinary strength and placed it at the service of those in need, help us to use our own gifts for the good of our brothers and sisters. May we never seek greatness in worldly power, but in selfless service. Following your example, protect, Saint Christopher, all travelers who journey the world's roads today. Watch over those who drive vehicles on dangerous highways, those who sail the seas, those who fly through the skies, and the pilgrims who advance on spiritual paths. Deliver them from all danger to body and soul. Intercede with the Lord for us, that in our passage through this valley of tears, we may never stray from the path that leads to eternal life. May we, like you, discern who is the true King worthy of being served, and give him our lives with the same generosity with which you offered yours. Saint Christopher, you who contemplated the face of the Christ child, help us to recognize him in the smallest and most vulnerable. May we never pass by the suffering of others, but, as you did by the rushing river, offer our shoulders to lighten the burdens of our brothers and sisters. In times of tribulation, when the weight of our crosses seems to exceed our strength, remind us that we too carry Christ, and that he, though he may seem to increase our burden, is in reality the one who sustains us and gives us the strength to go on. Finally, glorious martyr, you who sealed your witness of faith with your blood, grant us the grace of final perseverance. May no temptation, no persecution, no difficulty ever separate us from the love of Christ, but following in your footsteps, may we remain faithful until our last breath. Saint Christopher, pray for us, that we may be worthy to attain the promises of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers,